Hello everyone, today we'll be looking at CosmosDB triggers. I'll go through some notes and some demos, which will inspire you to use triggers within your own CosmosDB solution. Quickly, what are triggers? It's custom code that is stored in a database. You would call it to execute that code whenever a document is modified. And there are two types of triggers. You have a pre-trigger and a post-trigger. And as the name suggests, they would run either before or after the request was made. And note that these triggers would then be sent with the request, which I'll get through in the next few slides. Quick notes on triggers. They don't take any input parameters. Like stored procedures, they're scoped to an execution context. Essentially, they would run within a partition. If you do use triggers, you would be consuming additional RUs over and above the insert, replace, or delete. And these triggers do not run automatically, which goes back to the previous slide, whereby you have to send your trigger with your request. So insert item A, run this trigger over here. So in terms of executing triggers, I spoke on this briefly, whereby each request needs to call the explicit trigger itself. So as I mentioned, you would insert this document, run this post trigger. Before you would update this document, you want to run these pre-triggers. Or you want to delete this document with this pre-trigger and those post triggers. But there's just one issue with this approach. In the documentation, it shows that even though you would pass the trigger name as a list, so you would say create this item and run these triggers, you can only execute one trigger per operation, which is, well, great, because then if you have multiple logic or multiple sub-functions within the trigger, you'd almost have to cram all of those functions and operations within one trigger. So I thought about ways that I could do it. I thought about maybe if I had a pre-trigger that ran post-trigger like operations, but that would involve having some kind of promise logic. I thought about maybe having a post-trigger that ran like pre-trigger logic, but that would mean that operations would be done twice because you'd almost have to pull the data that you inserted, operate on it, and then reinsert it back into the database, which is a bit messy. Another thing that's also messy is to run a trigger and use the Azure functions or change feed approach, because then you'd almost have to track between those two things. So it's a bit tricky in those two aspects, as well as a third. Then I also thought in terms of trigger operations, the data isn't essentially inserted yet when the triggers ran, and I'll actually touch on that point. So I had trouble trying to figure out how to run either a pre-trigger or a post-trigger, but I knew I needed to do something. So I looked at the documentation again, and I thought, well, there has to be a way to run both of them, and there is. So going back to this initial slide, you can run a insert or an operation with a post trigger, an update or an operation with a pre-trigger, and you can run an operation with a pre-trigger and a post-trigger, and that's something I'll show within the documentation. Quickly, before we get there, with some pros and cons. Because the triggers have to be explicitly called, it means that we can dynamically execute triggers with our operations. So we can almost build code to run certain triggers for certain operations or certain triggers for certain use cases, because not every trigger or not all the triggers run on all the operations. They have to be explicitly called. But the disadvantage of that is that we need to call the triggers each time we do an operation, which might be a bit tedious to keep track of, and it might leave room for human error. Another disadvantage is that, as I mentioned, the transaction success is bound to the trigger success. What that means is that if you have a replace operation that would run, and your trigger fails, the replace would not go through, irrespective of whether that was a pre-trigger or post-trigger. Another example is that if you have an insert statement, you're inserting a document and you have a pre-trigger. If the pre-trigger fails, the insert will not be inserted. The same is true for the post-trigger. If you updated something and then you had a post trigger run, if that post trigger fails, then the update will not go through. So both the trigger and the insert or the update or the operation need to succeed, which is a catch-22. What I mean by catch-22 is that it can either be an advantage or a disadvantage, whereby if you have validation and you don't want inserts to run because something is missing in the document, then you can fail the trigger and that will prevent any inserts coming in. But on the flip side, if the trigger has an issue or if the trigger doesn't work, it might result in some inserts or updates not coming through, and then additional troubleshooting would be needed to check the trigger itself, and that's additional work in terms of the whole solution. So they're bound to the trigger success is bound to the transaction success, and depending on your use case, it might be a benefit or a disadvantage. So I mentioned trigger operations. You can have operations run for either pre-trigger or post-trigger, and these can be done on creates, replacements, updates, and deletions. Or you could have a catch-all statement whereby your trigger would run if any of the above actions are run, and these are the same for both pre-trigger and post-triggers. So I have a table here for the request type and the associated trigger option, and these trigger options would be the syntax or the settings that you would put within the CosmosDB interface. So in today's example, we're just going to create a pre-trigger to validate some date inputs for our movies database, and we're going to create a post-trigger to update a tally of movies for a given genre. And we're going to use that as maybe a catch-all. There are some things that we are going to do in addition to this so that we can have a few learning moments. So within Visual Studio Code, I have this small application here that is based on the stored procedure application that we built in the previous video. And all it does is that it takes a random movie and it tries to insert it into CosmosDB with the associated trigger. The code for connecting to Cosmos, fetching the movie, and running the triggers have all been encapsulated within different scripts just to make it look a bit more cleaner. So the triggers file here has all the different triggers that we are going to run within this application. And within the application, as I mentioned, the files have been split into different folders. And within the Cosmos backup, those are the actual JavaScript triggers that we are going to run. But first, would you create a trigger within Cosmos? Well, the Visual Studio Code extension for Azure doesn't have a input for triggers like stored procedures. So we're going to have to jump into Cosmos for this one. Within Cosmos, to create a trigger, you would have to click on this dialog here, the drop down, and you can create a stored procedure UDF as we did in previous videos, or you can click on new trigger. So you would place in the trigger ID, which would be the name of the trigger, and the same name that is placed here is the name that we're going to use within our code. You would select whether it's a pre or a post trigger, and you would select the trigger operation that this trigger is associated to. So you can have create, delete, replace, or the catch-all. After you created all of these options, you would then run, or rather type, the trigger body within here. And what I would usually do is that I would write the trigger syntax within a code editor, and then I would paste it in this box over here and then click save. There are means of registering and creating triggers programmatically, but that's a subject maybe for another video. Jumping back within Visual Studio Code, we'll go through the first trigger that we are going to run, called validate movie date. This trigger will essentially take the request object and look within the body to see if it can find a timestamp attribute. If it doesn't find a timestamp attribute, it's going to throw this error saying that we didn't find a timestamp within the movie, and then it would say the movie name. If not, then it will set the request body to create the item. So essentially this trigger, what it does is that it validates the schema of a document, and if a certain record is missing, the trigger would fail, which in sense would also fail the insert. So I'm going to jump into this trigger file here, and we're going to notice that there's two triggers that we're going to look into. There's the try validation trigger and there's the run validation trigger. Essentially, they're doing the same thing to call the validate movie date, which we recently spoke of. But notice in the container.createItem method that the trigger option in the try validation trigger is passed as a keyword argument, whereas in the run validation trigger, it's passed as a variable or a parameter. And we will discuss this shortly. So within the insert movie py script, we are going to run the try validation trigger first. So we're running it, it fetched the movie Ace in the Hole, and then at the bottom here you would see the response, which is strange because the trigger was supposed to fail. So in Cosmos, we'll run a check to see if there is a document with the ID of the movie name. And when the query runs, we notice that the movie was inserted, which is strange because it wasn't supposed to be inserted based on the validate movie dates syntax. So we need to check why is this the case. So going back to our documentation, we use the keyword argument as highlighted in red, which we picked up from the Microsoft documentation, and that is for the create item parameter. But what we notice if we go into the Cosmos documentation, a different documentation for the same create item method, what we notice is that the pre-trigger include is passed as an optional string parameter. The same is said for the post-trigger include. So this documentation is saying that it's passed as a parameter, whereas the previous documentation is saying that it's passed as a keyword argument. What we also notice is that within the same documentation, the one that says you need to pass it as a parameter, the keyword argument list does not include a pre-trigger or a post-trigger include. So what we'll do is that we'll run the second one, which has the parameter instead of the keyword argument, and we'll see that that works. So when in doubt, it's always best to check the documentation. So back in Visual Studio Code, we're going to run this version of the trigger, which has the pre-trigger include as a parameter instead of a keyword argument. So I'll jump back into Insert Movie and I'll do the necessary commenting so that we can run the other version, which has pre-trigger include as a parameter. And I'll save this file and then proceed to run. So we have this movie here, and then we have what seems to be an error message. And if we scroll within this error message, we'll see that we then pick up the error that we coded, no timestamp found in the movie. And we can also do a check within Cosmos to see if it wasn't inserted. So within Cosmos, what I'll do is that I'll just replace this ID with the one from our previous example. And we should notice that the query brings back no results, which goes way back to the previous slide, where in the previous slide we mentioned that the transaction success is bound to the trigger success. So because the trigger itself failed or through an error, the insert was not inserted. As I mentioned, that is a catch-22, but in this case we wanted the insert not to go through and it accomplished what we needed. But in other cases, it might lead to bugs or behavioral changes that you didn't expect within your code. So back in Visual Studio Code, we're going to run a trigger to intercept the response and update the attributes before it's inserted. So I'm going to open this intercept method and we're going to go through it. So within this intercept method, it runs a pre-trigger called intercept movie date. So let me open up that file. And we have it here. So from previous videos, you'd have seen that I've struggled to get dates to work on CosmosDB. And what this trigger will do essentially is to take the movie date, which is formatted in a different format highlighted over here, DDMMYY, and it will reformat that date into YYYMMDD, so the year, the month, and the date, and the day. So within the intercept movie date function, I haven't touched on this yet, but these two variables here, the context and the request, is similar to the stored procedure syntax that we covered. So the context would essentially be the partition, and the request would be the request that was sent through. So the actual create item, replace item, or delete item. Then in terms of item to create, we're just creating a replica of the request body that we can operate on. So what this function will do is that with this replica of the item that we want to create, we are going to get the release date property variable column. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to create an array of date parts by splitting that string. And then with that array of date parts, we're just going to reverse it and then join it back together. Once it's joined back together, we are going to then update that column within the body, which shows how this pre-trigger will update an existing column to another, or an existing value or attribute to another value. And then what it also will do is we will create a timestamp, because in our previous example, we saw that the body of the request didn't have a timestamp, and I'll show you what the request would look like. So within the request, this is the sample format, and we notice that, okay, we have a release date, which is in the format day, month, year, and we do not have a attribute called time stamp. No results. So what the intercept movie date function will do is that it will change the format of the date, as well as add a column called timestamp. Column attributes will use interchangeably in this method. Then what it will do is that we'll set the request body to that newly mutated item, and then once it's inserted, we should see those results reflecting the new movie that we're going to insert. So let's run this example. So back here, I'm going to uncomment this line, save the file, and run the script. So we have this movie that we want to insert. I'll copy the string here. And then we have the response as well that we got back right over here. So notice in this response, there is a time stamp over here. And notice how the date has been changed. So we have 1956, March 12th. And over here, we had 12th of March, 1956. So this intercept trigger essentially took this request over here on top, mutated it, and then inserted it into the database. So I'm going to take the name and check in CosmosDB. In CosmosDB, what I'll do is that I'll just change this query, execute it, and we see we have the results here. And then, as I mentioned, there is a timestamp and the date format has been changed. And with this date format, it might be then easier to run date-related queries, provided all the dates are within a certain format. So that is our first example in terms of pre-triggers. We saw how to create a validation type of step, whereby if a certain column is missing, we do not insert the file. And then we also saw a intercept type of trigger, whereby before we insert the file, we make some changes to the actual request body, and then we insert the file with those two changes. But now we're going to look at some post triggers. So I have this one called run count trigger, which essentially will just run a count of all the movies within a genre after a item has been inserted. So I'll jump into that. Within this trigger body or script, we're going to see the run trigger, and what it does is that it will run the count movie and genre trigger. So I'll open up that file and we'll read what it does. It's quite a bit lengthy because post triggers have more beefy syntax. Essentially what post triggers can do over pre-triggers is that post triggers can actually change the body of the response that the user or the client or the calling application gets back, whereas pre-triggers would just return the actual inserted item. So we're going to look into that. So within this count movie genre, as I mentioned, we're going to get the context and the request. Then one thing we're going to do is to get the collection. So the collection is all the documents within that partition. In our case, it's all the documents that have a certain primary genre. So instead of running a query to query all of those documents then count it, we already have the partition, or we already have the collection from this context.get collection. So that's a neat way of just finding out all of the documents that's in that collection instead of re-querying the data. But what we are going to do is that we're going to run a view query. So we're going to select movies from M, and we are going to then also have a function which is going to essentially give us back a custom response. So we are going to take the context and we are going to get the response. And once we have the response, we're going to set the body of the response to this new custom object, which essentially has attributes for the genre, which is the primary genre, the size, so how many movies are in that genre, and inserted, what was inserted recently, or the request essentially that was to be inserted. So similar to stored procedures, we are running this continuation model whereby the operation is going to run and give back a Boolean. And if that Boolean is true, then the operation ran perfectly. But if that Boolean is false, which means that the operation, whether it is to query the documents, replace the documents, update the documents, or delete the documents, if that didn't go through, it's going to give back a false. And if it gave back a false, we can throw an error with certain logic. One thing I noticed as well is that if we throw an error, or if the operation here doesn't run, then the same is true for this post trigger as it was for the pre-trigger, whereby if the trigger fails, then the update, delete, insert will not go through. So looking at this is accepted, all we're doing is that we're creating the documents for the collection using that where query. And once we have back the feed or the response, we are passing it back into this callback function. These are terms that we would have discovered or unpacked within the stored procedures video. So in this callback function, if there is an error, it will throw the error. If the feed or the response is either null, doesn't exist, or empty, then we're going to run this set response function with a size of 0. So by default, if there's nothing in the response, or if we queried all the movies and we got back no results, then obviously the response is 0. Else, what we'll do is that we'll run the set response method with the size equal to the length of the feed. That's why we put the set response method outside of this method, because we didn't want to repeat this twice within here and here. So that is the count movie and genre method. It's quite a bit lengthy, but it does achieve what we want to do. So I'll jump back here and I will run this trigger. Okay, so we have this movie here. And we have as well a slight error in terms of the background syntax or the background documentation, but the request did go through. So what we see here is a custom response as per the post trigger, which will give us the genre size, which is 2, and what we inserted here. But one thing we notice is that, or in terms of testing, is that this genre size is 2, but if we go into CosmosDB, we might see a different number. So back in CosmosDB, what I'll do is that I'll run a query to count all of the documents or movies within the genre called thriller. Right. And when we run this, we notice that we have 3, whereas in the Visual Studio Code, we had 2. And if I run a query just to select all the movies where thriller is the primary genre, we would notice that, okay, we have the 3 movies, but then we also have the one that was inserted last, which could only mean that because the trigger runs with the request, it means that when we ran the select star from movies, it didn't include the movie that we were about to insert, or the movie that we had quote unquote inserted, because the post trigger doesn't, or if we run any queries for the post trigger, it doesn't include the actual movie or the actual document that we inserted, because the document has not been inserted yet. So that is something that is just to be noted. If we are running a post trigger, that any queries or any selects on the documents needs to take into account that the actual document has not been inserted yet. What that means is that this genre size here is 2 movies within the partition thriller, excluding this movie that has to be inserted. So if you're doing any aggregations or any tallies, you just need to take into account that this 2 is actually 2 plus this 1. And that might maybe just align with any counting or aggregations that you need to do. Okay, so that would then solve the pre-trigger to validate, the pre-trigger to update items before a document is inserted, as well as the post-trigger to actually count a tally of movies within the genre. In the post-trigger, we noted that any counts or any aggregations need to take into account that the item has not been inserted yet until the trigger has concluded. So there might be some movies plus 1, movies minus 1 type of logic that you need to put within your solution. The last example is to actually run a pre-trigger and a post-trigger in one loop. So what I'll do is I'll run 2 versions. I'll run the run validation and then count just to show the differences, as well as the run interception and count. So within the run validation and count, what it'll do is it will run the pre-trigger to validate the movie if it has a timestamp. And because it doesn't have a timestamp, it will fail. And then it will try and run the count, and we'll see the behavior that it brings back. So jumping into the triggers, the way to run a pre-trigger and a post-trigger, at least in Python, it still needs to be checked if we could do the same thing within other programming languages. But within Python, because the pre-trigger and the post-trigger are passed in as separate variables, we are able to run them both together, or at least one after the other, depending on how the back-end SDK works. So we have container.create item, then we have the item that we're going to create, and then we have a reference to the pre-trigger, which is validate movie date. And we have a reference to the post-trigger, which is count movie in genre, both of which we've covered in the previous 2 or 3 examples. So we're going to then run this trigger. So, okay, we have here contract on Sherry Street, the movie we're about to insert, but then we have this error that pops out over here, which means that it did the pre-validation, and as soon as it failed, both the insert and the post trigger didn't run, and we're going to check that on CosmosDB. So within CosmosDB, I'll run a query to see if that movie was inserted. And we get back no results. So that's a nice way of, as I mentioned, a catch-22 of first validating something, and if the validation fails, then it doesn't insert and it doesn't run the aggregation. So instead of how many odd movies there would have been in the specific genre, there isn't any movies in that genre because the validation failed. So that's a nice way of managing what goes through and what doesn't go through. So what we'll do now in Visual Studio Code is that we'll run the interception trigger and then the count trigger. So essentially based on our examples, the interception trigger will update the movie release date as well as insert a timestamp. Then the count trigger will actually count how many movies are in that genre, excluding the movie that we were about to insert. So if I jump into the execution, we're going to get back this movie that was inserted, and then we're going to have the result as well. So within the result, we see that it is a drama movie. The genre size is 8 plus this movie, as well as the movie that was inserted. And if you look at the movie that was inserted, there is a timestamp attribute, as well as the date being in year, month, day. So from this example, we can actually see that you can run a pre-trigger and a post-trigger, and then you can have separate logic within those 2 trigger types. It would be interesting as well to see if we could have a post-trigger versus a change feed type of scenario, but that might be for a future video. So now we actually know how the code works in terms of triggers, and all of this is based on just reading through the documentation and finding a bit of nuances between the 2, and I definitely believe that this helps in terms of your trigger solutions. But just a quick summary, we know that there are 2 types of triggers that are sent with the request. Both a pre-trigger and a post-trigger can be run. What we've determined is that this is true for Python, but we need to probably check for other programming languages. The syntax for the triggers is basically the same as the syntax for the stored procedure. So you have context, you have context.getBody. You also have the same continuation model in terms of is accepted. So what we've learned within the stored procedures syntax in terms of how to structure that JavaScript file is exactly the same for the triggers. Then we also saw how to create a trigger within the CosmosDB interface, and we saw how to run a trigger from a code editor or a programming language. Then what we also saw is that in terms of CosmosDB, if we are stuck between the parameters or how to call or register a trigger, it's best to check different types or different versions of the documentation and compare the results between them. All right, now that we got triggers to work, as I mentioned, there's other things that we can also do. We can compare if triggers are better than Azure functions. We can compare how to run triggers and the different triggers we can run. But all these ideas and projects we're going to do in future videos. And I'm keen to hear what are your thoughts in terms of running triggers and how to use them best. We'll see you in the next video.